Welcome to 22 George Street. I'm your host, George. Looking at the rise and fall of economies, at the transformation societies go through, we are often left wondering, what truly determines a country's trajectory? If you ask Darren Acemoglu, winner of the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics, he will tell you that institutions are the key to prosperity and decline. Jared Diamond, author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, will argue that geography is destiny. But both perspectives, to some extent, lean towards a form of determinism. Either historical institutions or environmental factors shape our fate, both forces are beyond human control. Does that mean the only alternative is waiting for a benevolent leader to guide us through? After exploring the psychology and spirit of China in my previous podcast series, today I turn to a different framework to examine the forces that shape societies, the concept of spontaneous order. This idea, developed by one of the most important economists and political philosophers of the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek, argues that social rules, market mechanisms, and legal systems are not products of top-down design but emerge organically from human interactions over time. Hayek emphasized that knowledge is distributed. No central planner, no matter how intelligent, can outthink the collective intelligence of a functioning market. Therefore, a market economy is not something that can be engineered by government policy but is rather an emergent phenomenon that arises from voluntary interactions and decentralized decision-making. This theory underpinned Thatcherism, Reaganomics, and Pinochet's economic reforms in Chile, all of which sought to restore market mechanisms and reduce the role of the state. Hayek is seen as a successor to Adam Smith, laying down the intellectual foundation of modern free market economics. And if any country once epitomized the principles of spontaneous order, it was Britain. Britain's rise to global dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries was not the result of a carefully planned economic strategy but rather the outcome of a system that allowed market freedom, rule of law, and contractual certainty to flourish. The 1688 Glorious Revolution firmly established a constitutional system where the monarchy was subject to the law, ensuring that the government could not arbitrarily interfere with markets. This restraint on power made Britain the first true rule of law economy, where businesses and individuals could engage in trade with confidence. Going back even further, Britain's free market tradition was no accident, it had deep legal foundations. The Magna Carta of 1215 laid the groundwork for limiting royal power and securing property rights, principles that later evolved into the common law system, where market rules were shaped not by state diktats but by legal precedents built over centuries. This environment provided the stability for business, trade, and investment to thrive. By the 19th century, Britain had become the ultimate embodiment of laissez-faire capitalism. The government adopted a hands-off approach, allowing market forces to dictate economic development. This was the era of industrial revolution, global trade expansion, and the transformation of Britain into the workshop of the world. The combination of Smith's vision of the invisible hand and Hayek's theory of spontaneous order reached its peak during this period. Yet today, if you walk through Adam Smith's birthplace, Kirkcaldy, Scotland, you will struggle to find much trace of his legacy beyond a plaque and a few cobblestones. His ideas, once the backbone of Britain's economic philosophy, are now little more than historical relics. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom is scarcely referenced in academia or politics. The nation that once led the world in championing free markets and limited government has instead embraced regulation, intervention, and bureaucracy. Britain has contracted the very disease it once criticized in China. The UK's economic freedom has declined, growth has stagnated, and society's confidence is waning. The country is losing high-net-worth individuals at a faster rate than any other developed economy, with businesses and investment capital fleeing to lower tax, pro-business jurisdictions. The pound has plummeted against the yuan from 16:1 to under 9:1 in recent years, a stark sign of Britain's declining competitiveness. A nation that once thrived on competition, innovation, and risk-taking is now increasingly bogged down by state control and bureaucratic inertia. This raises a fundamental question: did Britain's spontaneous order fail, forcing the government to step in? Or has the expanding role of the state itself suffocated the market, preventing it from functioning effectively? If it is the former, then perhaps we can attribute Britain's decline to structural factors, industrial stagnation, declining social mobility, and global competition, forces that the market itself could not resolve, necessitating state intervention. But if it is the latter, then it is government intervention that has systematically eroded the market's ability to self-regulate, introducing regulatory burdens, complex tax structures, and policy volatility that have suffocated the economy. Looking at real-world examples, the evidence strongly suggests the latter. A well-functioning market should be able to adjust supply and demand organically, but the UK's housing market is a textbook case of government overreach strangling market efficiency. The Green Belt policy, designed to limit urban expansion, has artificially restricted housing supply, driving up prices to unsustainable levels. On top of that, excessive tenant protections and punitive property taxes have discouraged landlords, leading to a rental crisis where demand vastly outstrips supply. The result? Home ownership is out of reach for many young people, and renting is becoming equally unaffordable. Rather than allowing the market to respond to demand by building more homes, government intervention has made the situation worse. Once the financial capital of the world, London is now hemorrhaging investment and talent. Instead of capitalizing on Brexit to deregulate and enhance competitiveness, the government has imposed even stricter financial regulations than the EU, pushing businesses to relocate to Paris, Frankfurt, or even further afield to Singapore and Zurich. Meanwhile, entrepreneurial activity has slowed, venture capital investment has dropped, and Britain's once thriving fintech and AI sectors have lost ground to competitors. Even India, once seen as a lagging economy, now produces more tech unicorns than the UK, simply because it has embraced a more competitive, business-friendly environment. The government's grip tightens further under the banner of climate change. Carbon taxes, restrictions on traditional energy industries, and aggressive net-zero policies have driven up electricity costs, increased business expenses, and reduced energy security. Ordinary Britons now face higher household bills and fewer choices, not because of natural market forces, but because of government-imposed constraints on the economy. Meanwhile, the spread of diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates has begun distorting corporate priorities. Companies are being forced to prioritize identity politics over meritocracy, shifting focus from productivity and competitiveness to meeting government-enforced quotas. This is not the organic evolution of markets responding to changing societal norms, but state intervention forcing an ideological agenda onto the private sector. The impact of all these policies is clear: Britain's economy is stagnating, its markets are shrinking, and its people are shouldering the burden of an increasingly interventionist state. GDP growth lags behind other major economies like the US, Singapore, and Ireland, corporate taxes remain high, labor laws are rigid, and productivity is falling. Public services, once a justification for Britain's high tax model, are underperforming. Infrastructure, healthcare, and transport are in decline, while taxes and the cost of living continue to rise. Liz Truss briefly attempted to reverse this trend with a Thatcher-style economic plan, emphasizing tax cuts and deregulation. But her proposals were met with fierce backlash, and she was ousted in just over 40 days, the shortest tenure of any British Prime Minister. Reform was rejected before it even had a chance to take hold, and Britain instead chose a more interventionist, state-heavy economic model. Britain has developed its own version of China's economic stagnation, not through state socialism, but through a creeping bureaucratic mindset that rejects free market dynamism. The only question is, will Britons realize this before it's too late? If Britain is to recover, it will not be through more regulation, redistribution, or intervention, but by once again unleashing the power of competition, innovation, and spontaneous order. The problem is that the political and intellectual climate in Britain today no longer aligns with these principles. There is an increasing fixation on equity over opportunity, stability over dynamism, and control over freedom. While the United States and Switzerland still emphasize the importance of individual initiative and economic flexibility, Britain seems to be drifting toward a model that prioritizes government-managed outcomes over market-driven success. The irony is that the very interference intended to create fairness is instead generating economic stagnation. Will there be a return to the ideals of Adam Smith and Hayek? Perhaps the next 20 years will provide the answer. Thank you for tuning into 22 George Street. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's continue this conversation. And as always, I hope you find yourself in a place where spontaneous order thrives. Until next time, ciao.